Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, Roger, go from
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final edition of Space News for 2019, the December 18 edition. This is Peter Auld, and we've got the full team here tonight with Tina Stagg, Michael Abdullah, and Angelo Di Grazia, all from the Space Association of Australia. So once again, we'll start with some local Australian news. Gilmour Space is scaling up for the next generation of rocket technology. The Australian rocket company Gilmour Space Technologies has signed a statement of strategic intent and cooperation with the Australian Space Agency. The signing ceremony at the company's new facility on the Gold Coast in Queensland last week was attended by Industry, Science and Technology Minister Karen Andrews and Australian Space Agency Deputy Head Anthony Murfitt. We recognise our responsibilities as a leading domestic space company, and today's signing documents our intention to help grow a sustainable space ecosystem here in Australia and provide world-class launch capabilities to the growing global small satellite industry, said the company's founder and CEO, Adam Gilmour. Gilmour Space is developing new hybrid rockets to launch small satellites into low Earth orbits by 2022. In the last 2.5 years, the company has successfully test-fired its proprietary hybrid rocket engine to a record 80 kilonewtons of thrust, completed testing of a semi-autonomous mobile launch platform in rural Queensland, raised 2 rounds of venture capital funding, signed a Space Act agreement with NASA, and tripled its team to 45 employees on the Gold Coast. Mr. Andrews said this new partnership shows the breadth of capabilities being developed in Australia. Dynamic companies like this also will inspire a next generation of space entrepreneurs by championing the role of space here on our shores. Mr. Murfitt agreed, saying Gilmour Space has raised the profile of Australia's space industry across the globe and inspired our children to get involved in space activities. The agency and Gilmour Space share the objectives of enhancing the capability, capacity and competitiveness of Australian space industry while being globally responsible. And some other Australian news. Australian company Sky and Space Global is shrinking the size of its constellation as it deals with funding problems. The Western Australian startup has plans for a constellation of 200 CubeSats to provide low data rate communications, but says its initial focus is on getting just 8 satellites into orbit. Difficulty obtaining financing has delayed Sky and Space Global's target launch, once anticipated for late this year to the end of next year. The company is trying to raise $15.8 million Australian dollars in the coming months after an unsuccessful attempt in August. And over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, space fans. Turning to New Zealand space news, Rocket Lab formally opened its US launch site last week and announced the Air Force will be the first customer launching from there. Rocket Lab said Launch Complex 2 at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport on Wallops Island, Virginia, was now complete, with the first Electron launch from the site scheduled for the second quarter of 2020. The Air Force's Space Test Program will launch a microsatellite called Monolith on that mission to test the use of large aperture space weather payloads on small sats. The launch site is designed primarily for US government customers who want to conduct launches from American soil and are interested in responsive launch capabilities. Meanwhile, Rocket Lab has debuted an autonomous flight termination system. Rocket Lab's 10th Electron launch earlier this month wasn't just a big deal for the company's reusability plans, it was also its first mission flying a fully autonomous flight termination system, or AFTS. Rocket Lab demonstrated the system on the Running Out of Fingers flight in a move that will enable a higher launch cadence and deliver responsive launch capability. AFTS is a GPS-aided computer-controlled system designed to terminate an off-nominal flight, replacing traditional human-in-the-loop monitoring systems. AFTS is crucial to increasing launch frequency and providing responsive launch capability while maintaining industry safety standards. It reduces the turnaround time between missions and provides greater schedule control by eliminating reliance on ground assets and human flight termination operators. With the first fully autonomous mission now complete, all future Electron missions from Launch Complex 1 on the Mahia Peninsula in New Zealand and Launch Complex 2 on Wallops Island will fly with the AFTS. The AFTS is yet another way Rocket Lab is innovating to increase the pace of launch and support responsive launch capability for small satellites, said Rocket Lab founder and CEO Peter Beck. Turning to NASA news and the Commercial Crew Program. NASA approved plans to launch Boeing's CST-100 Starliner commercial crew vehicle on a test flight this week. NASA said the uncrewed test flight cleared its flight readiness review, allowing work to proceed on the launch of Orbital Flight Test 1, scheduled for 10:36 p.m. this Friday, December 20, Australian Eastern Summer Time. A launch that day would have the Starliner dock with the International Space Station a day later, remaining there for nearly a week before landing at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. A successful flight would allow Boeing to proceed with a crewed test flight sometime in the first part of 2020, although neither NASA nor Boeing would be more specific on when they expect to be ready to fly that mission. And to NASA's SLS and Orion program. As NASA marks completion of the first Space Launch System core stage, it's working on a long-term contract it believes will reduce the cost of future vehicles. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said last week the agency was in negotiations with Boeing on a long-term production contract that would seek to lower the cost of future vehicles. Bridenstine said in an interview that while the SLS currently costs $1.6 billion each, the goal is to reduce that cost to about $800 million. While SLS prime contractor Boeing is optimistic about quickly increasing SLS production rates to 2 vehicles per year, Bridenstine said he was not counting on having that increased production in place by 2024. And over to Michael.
Thank you, Tina. And turning to NASA planetary and space science programs, NASA has pinpointed an area where astronauts could land on Mars. Scientists discovered a vast region of Mars where water ice sits just a few centimetres below the surface. Because the area is not at the planet's poles or equator, it offers a promising place to land astronauts someday. Landing near accessible stores of ice is crucial because astronauts on Mars would need a way to make drinking water and create rocket fuel for the journey back to Earth. And NASA has selected a place on the asteroid Bennu where its OSIRIS-REx spacecraft will attempt to collect samples. Project officials said the spacecraft would attempt to collect a sample from a crater called Nightingale in the northern latitudes of the asteroid. The mission will use a sample collection mechanism on the end of a robotic arm to grab up to 2 kilograms of rock and soil. The site selection process was more difficult than scientists originally envisioned, since the asteroid's surface is littered with boulders that are hazards to any collection effort. If OSIRIS-REx is successful in collecting these samples next August, it will return them to Earth in 2023. And turning to European news. A super cool addition to the European Space Agency's Deep Space Tracking family is coming to Australia. ESA is building its 4th Deep Space Tracking antenna that will ensure upcoming missions like JUICE and the HERA mission have someone to talk to when they get to space. Deep Space Antenna 4 will be located at the New Norcia ground station in Western Australia, home of Europe's first 35-metre antenna. ESA's S-Track network is currently made up of 3 deep space tracking stations across the globe, as well as a number of smaller dishes, and is running at peak capacity. Following analysis of future mission needs, the 4th antenna will provide communications support to upcoming European and non-European deep space missions. The antenna feed, through which data flows in from space, will be cryogenically cooled to just 10 degrees Kelvin, only 10 degrees above absolute zero, or about minus 263 degrees C. Using this technique is expected to increase the amount of data returned by an incredible 40% at the high frequencies used for spacecraft command and control. Such technology will also be installed into other existing tracking stations, dramatically increasing the amount heard from space. Work should be finished on the New Norcia station by the end of 2023, ready to begin operations by mid-2024, just in time for the JUICE and Hera missions.
Thanks, Mike. Let's go to Russian news. A Russian opposition leader has criticised the Roscosmos chief for his lavish lifestyle. In a video, Alexei Navalny criticised Dmitry Rogozin for taking a salary of $460,000 a year and buying expensive cars and homes. "We have nothing against large salaries," Navalny said, "but why is it so insanely large? Is there really that much excess money in our budget?" Clearly not. Okay, back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Angelo. Turning to China. A Chinese company has tested an engine that will be used on the country's Long March 8 rocket. China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation said it successfully test-fired the liquid hydrogen-liquid oxygen engine for the second stage of the rocket. The Long March 8, slated to make its debut next year, will be able to place up to 5 metric tons into sun-synchronous orbits, and is designed to be built and launched rapidly. And now to India. India is preparing to build a second launch site in the country to support a small launch vehicle. ISRO has started to acquire 930 hectares of land in southern India for the launch site. The facility would be used by the new small satellite launch vehicle under development, particularly for missions to sun-synchronous and other polar orbits. ISRO hasn't announced when it expects the launch site to be ready. Okay, and so over to Peter.
Thanks, Mike. Japan's Hayabusa 2 spacecraft has begun its trip back to Earth. The spacecraft started its ion engines last week to start moving away from the asteroid Ryugu, beginning a year-long trip back to Earth. The spacecraft will return samples it collected from the surface of the asteroid earlier this year. And over to you, Angelo.
Okay, let's go across to commercial space news and, of course, SpaceX. A second drone ship has joined the SpaceX's fleet in Florida. The ship, just read the instructions, arrived at Port Canaveral last week, where another drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You, is based. Just read the instructions had been based on the West Coast but moved to Florida after undergoing maintenance in a Louisiana shipyard. The move is intended to support an anticipated increase in launches from Cape Canaveral, such as the company's Starlink constellation. Now to Blue Origin. Blue Origin's new Shepard suborbital vehicle made its first flight in more than 7 months last week. The vehicle lifted off from the company's West Texas site, reaching a peak altitude of about 105 kilometres on the 10-minute flight. The vehicle carried a number of research and educational payloads, from science experiments to postcards contributed by children. The flight was the first since May for the vehicle, but the 6th flight of the reused booster, which is a record for Blue Origin in terms of relying on and recovering one of its rocket stages. Blue Origin, which had planned to start flying people this year, acknowledged it would need another couple more flights before it would be ready to begin crewed test flights and then take paying passengers. So, Peter, I hope you've got your money ready to go on this one.
I'm starting a GoFundMe now.
Meanwhile, Blue Origin is continuing to expand the number and size of its facilities. The company has opened an office in the Los Angeles area to work on propulsion systems. It is also continuing to work on an expansion of its headquarters in the Seattle suburb of Kent at the same time as a new engine production factory in Huntsville, Alabama, and launch vehicle facilities in Florida. Okay, back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Andrew. And finally tonight, Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins has been awarded the 2019 Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy. Collins, who was the Apollo 11 command module pilot for the first moon landing in July 1969, was presented with the trophy at an event in Washington last week. Collins, who also flew on Gemini 10, was given the award for his lifelong dedication to aerospace and public service in the highest order, both as a pioneering astronaut and inspired director of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. So there it is. That's the show for this year. Just before we leave, we'd just like to go around the room and find out everyone's highlights and lowlights for 2019. You want to jump in?
Oh, I could start if you like.
Sure.
I guess for me, it's a trifecta of SpaceX. The highlight, demonstration mission 1, which went to the space station, rip-roaring success. But then not long thereafter was the low light, where the Crew Dragon that was used on that flight blew up. But then for me, the big highlight was actually seeing the Mark 1 Starship actually put together and not long thereafter dismantled again, but it showed the future then and there. So that was good. That was great.
The significant thing was, one of the significant things was Donald Trump's commitment to go back to the moon by 2024. That happened earlier this year. It certainly put a rocket up a lot of people.
Pardon the pun.
I think, whether he, happens to be the second year, the last year of his second term in office if he gets it. So I don't know whether there's a bit of boondoggling there, but anyway, I think it's pie in the sky, but it's certainly got a lot of momentum happening behind it. Whether or not it follows up with money and actual hardware and things, there seems to be so many unanswered questions, as is usually the case with things related to Donald Trump. I guess it is a kind of a highlight. Low light for me was probably the ISRO's unsuccessful moon landing attempt, but they're jumping straight back on the horse and giving that a go again, so good on them on that one. Tina?
Well, I would have to say that the highlight of my year has been joining the Space News presenting team. And conversely, the low light of my year would probably be joining the Space News presenting team.
Well, it's certainly been a highlight for us, Tina. Honestly, having you on board has been great.
But seriously, I think certainly the DM1 flight to the ISS was a highlight for me. The clouds parted here in Tasmania, and I was actually able to see the Dragon spacecraft station keeping with the ISS,
Wow.
which was an amazing thrill for me.
We had clouds that night, if I recall. But, hey, it's not all over yet. Remember, this week we've got Boeing. Hopefully they'll repeat the DM1. And this time, Tina, I'm going to see if I can see it before you, station keeping onto the space station.
Yeah, that will be good. Over the year, the Australian Space Agency has certainly shown its value and certainly been drumming up a lot of activity, whether it turns into hardware and rockets and things like that and things that we're interested in. Not quite sure, but it seems like there seems to be a more coordinated voice anyway, and cooperation and agreements being signed all over the place. So watch your space, pardon the pun again.
My low light for the year would have to be the death of Russian cosmonaut Alexei Leonov.
Indeed.
Oh,
He
yes,
was the
of
first
course.
man to walk in space. He was a talented artist and I'm told a very mischievous and fun-loving character, and he will be greatly missed by the space community.
Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure getting together with each of you over the year. It's been a lot of fun. And Andrew, thank you for having us join the show and barge our way in as we've done over the last couple of years now. All right, let's wrap this up. Thanks again, everyone, for the year, and we'll see you all next year. And that's it for us.